Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in to Entelocius. My name is Paul. A quick disclaimer. I do not intend this episode, or any other episode for that matter, to be financial barometry nor investment advice, but I would be happy to know if it proves influential to decision making in the comments. So, however we reserve or confide our pledges to corporate ontologies, that is, however likely we are to attribute value or to sulk from identification our resident monstrosities, we are deeply indebted their perseverance and evolution. The bordello exaggeration of available purchase and reinforced material finitude are no laughing matters, and they confide their quarters many imperceptible longevities. Western and New World culture is largely inextricable from its companies, and at the very least corporate identity benefits clearly the passage of time. Sooner or later, our passive recollections are tied or put together piece by piece through corporate signification. And I mean, what else would we do? No matter the lengths we lament our spans of attention like ripened spoils to send cathected, we have bought ourselves into utopian perils at the small price of subjugations. Verily, what preferable alternative could the world devise to keep its strings attached, to ensure it had pace to keep? Decentralization is not an alternative to entrenchment. First, we must resolve where to dig ourselves out. And marginal contests with elitism and impoverished values sound more like problems you fight through than existential threats. We seek proof of integrity, but instead we defy. When we can no longer endure the labor, we push the machine. Companies not only subsist but compel us, and business affairs provide, if nothing else, convenient structure and compelling regularity, and they imbrue human societies with levels of order and compunction we would not otherwise easily reconcile nor avidly traverse. True, they are scandalous failures of will, gargantuan, unrepentant self-obsessions, and crass, hideous, unmoored allegories for Potemkin authority, tautological primacy, and the pinhead suffocation of creative drive. Their presence paradoxically delimits expansion, and not every delimiter the world can decoct is sufficiently permissive to trust its own presence. Certainly not a company worth its credit would call itself permissive. The most intimate portrayal of the corporate is the family. Heritage and families were largely the only original corporate identities, but their spirituals have since been supplanted with startup hypomania, jumpstart injection policy, and linchpin ideationalism. And they are now sorely beleaguered antipodes to cutthroat cyclism and dirty, marmot-like hole-mongering. Interestingly, from the bargain traditionalism and original dust we kicked around, we treat business today like a cataplexic know-it-all, somehow indifferent to its own relations, or like a runaway child, in terms that we refuse to mention failure for fear of eloping the consequent. On the other hand, the quotient of relative development of a country is assumed to follow first nationalistic corporatization, followed then by transnational corporatization, or how well a company can assimilate or fit. But this is not necessarily an accurate metric for development, as illustrated with the well-known case of the Russian McDonald's. Clearly, the corporate suffers impoverished translation, or it can be clumsy when it attempts to reconcile changing circumstances. Or, and perhaps most accurately, it actually requires its own battleground removed, that is, immunized, public paces and vagaries, much like an antechamber in which it can ostensibly discuss its own subject. But what should we make of policy, honestly, which substantiates its own worth on its own terms? No matter what we say about job-making, opportunities, inventory, or development, none of these things are inherently self-justifying. And more importantly, they cannot justify corporate existence or means production in and of themselves. In fact, means production is our synthetic rhizome, and we can attribute its synthesis rampant destructuration based from primitive spread and competitive convenience. However, the synthetic corporate rhizome is used for substitute and subterfuge, and in the process contributes falsity it does not relish brevity to clarify. And at what point, if any, do we cease creating and manipulating designs of the family tree to justify corporate exacerbation? The family tree is much too lengthy for reproduction. and surely we are desirous of better than scalar ownerships to explain enormous contributions. It seems to be the case outgrown companies are now coming from visible strength, in historical terms, against vacuous politicizations. And they are collectively transitioning to static folds wherein presence, that is, the audacity of position, must be mutually intermanaged against perpetual threat, namely landscape inequalities and disconformities. Virtually, the corporate is nothing without its petty neighborhood, the experimental enclosure built uniquely to assume its stead. And ultimately from these quarters it acquires tolerance for cantankerous politicizations, affectations, and dysregulations in the same way that blood does. However, these come steeply at the expense of filial computation, the reliable, normalized brevity, what with a knowable place, the suggestion of home of your brother or sister, which is like the loss of trustworthy vision or solid feet to stand on. And quite sharply, the global landscape puts modern corporate histories to death. Nowadays, the key is production. The vacuum emergence of latent emergence, so to speak, skipping rampantly, as opposed to raw ensembles. Age is said to be important to corporate identity, but I hold it has little to no domain any longer, except insofar as it provides figurative shelter, which is then reinforced from existing tractation. The exception to this is when multilateral agreements like the European Union are bought into, producing complicities to terms of agreement which stabilize markets which become, in turn, regressed with age. On the related hand, inertia from age is becoming more and more preponderant, and the market prefers to capitalize its ecologies, to leave its lesser pawns and devour its lesser fish, than to encourage gains of momentum from inertia. The patterns of interlocking directorates, where directors sit on multiple company boards, reflect ad libitum indulgence for directorship and governance, in that if a regulatory policy exists, it is not evident to me, suggesting that, at their highest level, the most stringent, nodular introductions to companies are poorly reflected from intrinsic corporate diversities. Companies are not as strongly affected from their directorships as we likely assume. And the purpose of these positions seems more strongly to emphasize the craft of seated situation, wherein companies which are bound to network terms will expand possible effect to the extent of the network itself, rather than for the sake of corporate strategy. We can roughly surmise countries of the European Union seek patronage or symbolic identity, rather than strategic identity, from their interlocking directorates, and the differences of their per-country expectable ratios, assuming an interlocking directorate is an adequate proxy for situated scalar corporate health, could merely reflect cultural place, access to cultural store, indiscrete cultural policy or idiosyncrasy, a rich man's sport, or some combination thereof. Clearly, companies are not as viable to rhizomatic completion as their specific means productions, but they are important to strategic identity and locality, which we will confront and discuss in various guises in future videos. They are also superficial to corporate stability. Interestingly, corporate stability has seemed largely, accepting the ostentatious self-evidence of bailouts and other legal crucibles, forcibly or coercively impressed onto civil society. Companies in their collection have quite obviously exhausted us their separate treatment of identities from historical and natural contingencies, and our effort either likewise reports their unflappable continuation, which is inherently retroactive and non-causal, kind of like a null variable, or dismisses their relevance. It is a flimsy divide. For instance, food stocks have not always flourished, or else if they have, we must have surpassed our highest industrial expectations long ago. Materials have not always been readily accessed nor supplied. Countries have torn themselves apart in the meantime, and so on. But these dynamic changes have seemingly never prospered corporate identities, suggesting the corporate would rather be specialized and excluded. Companies do not tend to reflect very many emergent properties apart from their means production, and for this reason we require what I call culminant scrutiny, emphasis at patriarchal or progenitor sources, where the average civil exposure has been sufficient to insist and characterize multifarious identities, kind of like a paternity test for influence. Take McDonald's. A number of properties emerge McDonald's independent of its assumed purpose as an establishment for dining, including that it is a place where vicarious integration not only takes place, but is materially advocated in terms of procurements, that it is a destination after drinking or doing drugs, and that it is a place to be employed or, depending on social predilections or narrow cultural disparagements, to avoid being employed. These are very different properties, and on a related note, perhaps corporate success can be attributed to some extent to propertic diversity. I can think for McDonald's also of busyness, laissez-faire etiquette, voluminousness and occupancy, and so on, all of which are promoted from their logo. Which leads me to my next point. Now, as exercises go, the deconstruction of logos can be trite and impressionistic, and rather lugubrious territory is quite starkly avowed when we take into consideration for sheer exertion the lengths logos are taken to swallow whole and repatriate desire. The logo is also a thread of oblivion of incommensurate social syntheses, of that is, burns and discalibrations, of fusions, that is, the free and basal entitlements to stir convivial social soups, and parsimony, that is, the social denominator. The Android droid suggests even the mediated companion is virtual. The Bacardi bat suggests thick, robust, and exotic or unfamiliar territory, wherein we do not expect similar social mores. Burger King suggests its own self. Adidas stripes suggest ranked or competitive starting points. Amazon suggests connection. Ram horns suggest retreat. Google colors bespeak subliminal as opposed to conspicuous fecundity. Coca-Cola suggests the waft of poured liquid or two activations of states of matter. Sony PlayStation suggests a mirror in which the player sees reflected virtualization of himself. Nestle suggests local community as an alien, precarious genus, and so on. The step from logo to branding is lowly, pseudo-actionary, something you might sooner trip over than take. Take the network example of sponsorship rosters. Whom companies enlist depends more on cultural period than athletic promise or acumen, attesting directly from our tacit enlistment to desire for embodied representation. From the patriarchal redemption of dry, inchoate capital, the corporate stronghold has lost form or signal, and it requires, at least at a particular point, to strike most soundly its frivolous dissolutions in the form of unimpugnable stances and faces. Likewise, for consumers, brands effectively perform the function of reduction. Brands reduce search costs by helping buyers identify specific products. And so very clearly, while we shop, we are, if nothing else, closing distance we did not necessarily know. And in condoning separations between corporate brand and individual product brand, companies posit their relative leisures or inoculations, like they are either fanning themselves or something away from them. We might assume the introduction of secondary levels to mean they are reassured their territories or are exploring alternative territories, whereas intractable primary levels conversely suggest alternative competitions. But here we go again. In a sort of rough temporal twist, the purchase, which is the terminus of corporate means production, is like the foreplay of general means production, in that it excites consumer awareness to contribute short promenade to corporate identity, similar to how desire, when it is stimulated, posits hyperextensions of both the actual and the virtual. Desire implores the actual to obtain its desirable point, and it implores the virtual to fetishize the unexpected. As you can see, we seek after the corporate not entirely for its possibilities, but for its fixations, and the absurd trademark companionship postulated from corporate realization is, fundamentally, strife and dehumanization. The corporate companionship requires mobility its systems cannot afford. The original position of the logo is itself an island, isolated, and within this brazen promise of completion, it is not much to cling to. There's only so much alter agreement the logo can renege, just like there's only so much complexity to corporate strata. Corporate identity, on the other hand, is the most caloric intensivity in the corporate pot, much the same as human identity is delicaste, strained, and amalgamated from embodied neural representations, where ontological identity from fervid sources is exactly the actual. In fact, these corporate and human facets are much more similar than we think, and they are perhaps as close as we will ever get to human and corporate intermarriage. If the internal permutations of human identity are suggestively and literally exponential, and whether tissue substrate is latent, palpable, significatory, and virtually and interminably boundless thereon, their insidious and degenerate expressions, which are to mean our self-containers or compositions or translated vessels, are surely neither. And this somatic motor invocation as being physically well-meaning and purporting at closure provides just enough order to sculpt interest the corporate justly as opposed to treacherously reserves. corporate identities are perhaps the only complex corporate system. We might create an octahedron of corporate vexation starting from identity and working our way from the top vertex to, below, unscathed or intentional disruptions or disorientations, the baseline affixation, and from the bottom vertex to, above, cornerstone corporate rhizomatic introductions, which are missives and failures. You can see quite easily how self-organization is logically built from failure. In between the top vertex and its base, you might put business-to-consumer corporations, given consumer give and take and their democratic regulation of the effective scope of disorientation. And in between the bottom vertex and its parallel or identical base, I place business-to-business corporations, whose sub-threshold services like solutions, deliveries, and mechanical and technical intangibles begin attributing excess desire and motor restlessness to qualities like performance and coordination, away from means production and towards deliverance and means sustenance. And in this way they commit subdivisions redolent of dystopian fantasy in spite of, or perhaps in consequence of, visible disformity or opacity. As for the physical contribution, the corporate is disproportionate to the same extent as the individual, but in the opposite way. The individual retrieves too little, whereas the corporate retrieves too much, and to function it must therefore expand its duplicity to account the second, submerged half of the pyramid, or iceberg. At root, corporate disorientations are like centrifugal or centripetal forces, and in contrast, quite unlike the genteel methodologies of suspected and implicated routine, that is, production, and impeccable, profit-emphatic standards, that is, means, they emphasize brutal, militaristic conformity, the equivalent in actionary sense to pulmonary shunts or whipped peaks. Now, you might expect the corporate credential to be conformist in and of itself, but in actuality it is merely superficial to conduction. These forces are few but potent, and they break ground most regularly against nation-states, or corpora without desire. Imagine you are depending on a particular material abroad, and your interactions with the supplier are mediated through the irreverent and rambunctious predilections of a remote country, or, as is the case working with China, your supply is fundamentally inextricable from its governmental oversight. Hence, in the absence of displaced desire, the intransigence of distribution directly knocks off the country with its insipid corps nu, as opposed to the company, with its degenerate powers of appellation, and in result, true-to-form suppliers have not tended to exist. Companies, particularly with very fluid inventory, have assumed these roles themselves. Across marketers and consumers, desire is either manipulated, serviced, or transacted, and the result of this sparse triangulation is desperation. The manipulable bill of sale brings desperation to prominence in different ways, but it is a fact people expect emotional ownership or substantial value from brands. Clearly, identity is a lesser tier to self-investment, that is placation, and for us the value of corporate identity scholarship is in respect that it shows us just how little flexibility suffers consumers and ideologues alike. When pillars of identity like culture, character, and covenants are under constraint, they reveal significant challenges of pressure. For example, there is not ample room for development of corporate communication, wherein tones about issues of public concern virtually never vary, and in actuality violate selection and make egregious understatement of their purpose. And the corporate covenant, or what is promised and expected of a company, often terminally inextricable from its communication, is more or less a promise made to itself, that is, self-sustenance, from which everything else logically proximally supervenes, like pieces of ice what broke from a flow. Hence, corporate conceptualizations or reputations are frequently the most important means for corporate differentiation. And as you likely figure, these are in constant, odious evolution. Rather than choose, they escalate like boiling water or hallucinations, and their divorce from tangible appropriation feeds back into a level of mystification which, ultimately, impels rather than propels corporate delectation. In fact, at the behest of desire, reputations inevitably produce gridlock or discombobulation, and thus it tends not to exist to any measurable extent except to ourselves. To some, it is entirely our desire rocking the ship, whether or not we are empowered to abandon it. And this ship of ours has numerous decks. There are non-profits, which are like the static bilge, where assumptions are met. Charities with lateral agreements outstruck like oars. Partnerships with pairwise accordances, motorized like rowers. Cooperatives like pseudo-rhizomatic cultural foolproof, or like visible builds of the ship. Co-productions, that is, the open source phenomenon. like the visible, shapeless rhizomatic enmeshment of the ship. And above deck, for-profit companies who are centralized, uplooking, and oblivious. The point of unification is to convene control back upon the tide, where the hierarchies of prosumers and the hierarchies of consumers are sublimated and experienced just outside their reconstructive amalgams. A ship does not float without problems. We have unreasonable lobbies, disunionization, injustice, and multifarious unfair treatments. Injustice and unfair treatment are intentionally separate, for the corporate has no barometer or literacy for justice and no aspiration to fairness except what can be procured for it. The anti-corporate perspective is, perhaps ironically, largely an oppressive, defeated slog. Civil suits rarely triumph, and companies themselves care only very rarely, and when they do we find them insincere or we assume it is a matter of hungry procedure or postural, virtual as opposed to actual, beneficence. The average recourse against corporate problem either does not exist except in fantasy or is petty, dismal charity, causing us to gradually overvalue corporate scope and overestimate corporate direction, and in compensation we miss our own specific targets, which means production is contrariwise happy to shamelessly subvert and resupply. Moreover, anti-corporate defense seems to beg its own question, in the sense that nearly every defense requires tractation only corporate strategy, as opposed to individual, familial, civil, grassroots, nor anarchic, makes feasible. And the circularity what inheres fighting uphill moral battles from rocky, entrapped, undermined philosophies spins sharp contrast honest ethic what can, to the same extent as compel corporate activity, attest corporate malpractice and disingenuous stride. In other words, sensible organization is apparently limited to the organization. An apparent defense, or better, retaliation that is generated or perpetrated against assumptions of corporate identity that are observed to be undesirable is the proverbial ransom, in which mostly technical aspects are held in miser privacies, and those responsible, much like outlaw bank robbers, do not seem to realize their limitations depend on the companies themselves. That is, the bank robbers require an exit from the building, and the ransom takers require a hole to sew. Surprisingly, at least to me, many more questions remain. How will the corporate successfully branch rural communities? Will package delivery be assumed sufficient without contribution to financial means? How will this asynchrony between withdrawal and supplantation be traded? How will these developments emerge without desynchronizing rural lives? How will isolated communities ever exceed or transcend their distance from corporate intent? Further, how can companies better endure legitimated pressure without succumbing to extirpative methods? On that note, I am at the end of episode 2. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please click like and subscribe. I encourage opinions, discussion, and suggestions in the comments below, particularly if you know any rhizomatic scholars or theories deserving of attention or integration. Episode 3 is about duplicities. So, mind your path, raise your vision, reach your arms, and steal your sight. Rhizomatic transcendence is around the corner. See you again.